everyone, in this video we are going to discuss an important topic from the module communication, that is barriers to effective communication. So if you consider the module communication, we have various aspects to consider there. We have this process of communication, which is an important area to focus on. Then we have these barriers, which is again an important area. Types of communication is again an important area to focus on. So there are certain areas that you have to approach in a very theoretical manner. You have to know about, let's say if you consider process of communication, you have to understand what are the elements that are associated with process of communication, and also you need to identify the right sequence as well. But there are certain areas in the module communication which is having a very gentle approach as well. You can expect gentle kind of questions like they'll ask you to identify the features of effective communication or effective communicator, or in order to make a communication more effective, especially in the classrooms, we need to identify certain options that can contribute to it. So these kinds of areas, these different perspectives can be identified in the area or in the module communication. So if you just focus on the areas that you need to understand in a very theoretical manner, or the areas in which you need an in-depth understanding, this barriers to effective communication is an important area. Okay, so we have various barriers to consider. Anyway, in this session, we'll be particularly focusing on 3 important barriers to effective communication. So in order to get into this topic in more detail, we were just considering a question from NTA UGC NET December 2022 from this area, and through this question, we'll be focusing on 3 important barriers to communication. And here you have the question. Which one of the following is excluded from the list of communication barriers? And we have the options: physical, semantic, philosophical, and psychological. So we have 4 different options given here, and we need to identify an option that we have or we can exclude from the list of communication barriers. That means from the options we have to identify an option that is not a barrier to effective communication. Okay, so if you consider these options, physical barrier is an important barrier, or it's an interruption that can affect the entire effectiveness of a communication. We have semantic barrier, and also we have psychological barrier as well. So this philosophical barrier is the option that you can exclude from the list of communication barriers given in the question. So in that manner, what we are going to do in this session is we are trying to understand the important types that are given, or the important types of barriers that are given in the options. We have physical barrier, semantic barrier, as well as psychological barrier. Okay, so what do you mean by physical barriers? So physical barriers are a result of disturbances in our surroundings which leads to ineffective communication. So if you are in a communication, there are certain things or certain happenings that, or certain things that happens in our surroundings that can actually disturb the entire communication process. Let's say if you're traveling and you're communicating, or if you're on your phone and if you're trying to communicate something to your family or your friend, in that point of time, if it's a very crowded day, a very crowded traffic day, then the sounds of the vehicles, the horns, all these things can affect your communication. So the other person who is in the receiver side, who is listening to you, cannot properly hear what you're saying, or in other words, or in other sense, you yourself, the sender himself at times cannot hear what the receiver or the person the other side is talking to or talking back to him. So this kind of disturbances that can happen, or the disturbances that is there in the environment in which we are communicating to each other, that can be called as physical barriers. So we can call it as the disturbances in our surroundings that can actually affect the effectiveness of communication. So the second important barrier that is mentioned in the question is psychological barriers. So what do you mean by psychological barriers? Sometimes strong emotions like anger or sadness, nervousness, personal grudges, etc. can affect our mental well-being, thus making communication less than effective. Such emotions, attitudes, etc. are known as emotional noise or psychological barriers. So please do remember that this psychological barriers can be also called as emotional barriers or emotional noise. So this noise is a very technical term that we use in communication. If you just consider the various models of communication as well, we can understand that this noise is the term that they are using in order to convey the idea of barriers. So noise is a very theoretical or a very appropriate term that we use in the context of communication. Anyway, please do remember that psychological barriers can be also known as emotional noise. So there are certain emotions, certain attitudes at times can affect our communication. Let's say if you have an idea about someone, and if you have some preconceptions about a person, or if you are not in good terms with a person, that can actually affect your communication. If that person comes to you and if that person is trying to convey something to you, you have a very biased mind, or your attitude to that person, your emotions to that person, all this actually affects the receptiveness, right? So in that sense, these kinds of emotions, attitudes, even if we are in a good mood, the sadness, nervousness, all these things can actually affect the communication process. In that manner, the psychological barriers is an important barrier that you can consider here. So the third important barrier that we have seen in the options was the semantic barrier. So semantic is a term that we always associate with language. So the semantic barrier can be associated, or it can be termed as language barriers basically. So it refers to the misunderstanding between the sender and receiver, arising due to the different meanings of words and other symbols used in the communication. So as the name suggests itself, the semantic barrier or the language barrier, so it is associated with some kind of misunderstandings that happens due to this the various nuances of a language. So we have certain words which is having the same spelling or which is having the same pronunciation, or certain words we use in different contexts, and in different contexts it provides different meanings. So let's say, for example, if you just take the word watch, for example, W-A-T-C-H. So watch is a term that we can use in order to, we're watching something, we're looking into something. So that is watch. And again, the thing that is on your hands, on your wrist, that is again called as watch, right? So the same word is having different meaning, the same spelling, same pronunciation, and this word is having different meanings in different contexts. So it's just an example. So this kinds of differences or the different meanings of words, and also we have this denotation and connotation. That is again a very important idea. In the previous years also, you can see they have asked questions in that perspective as well. So denotative means the literal meaning of a word, the literal meaning, the meaning that you get from a dictionary. That is a denotative meaning. And connotative meaning is more like it's kind of contextual meaning. So that is what this connotation is all about. So certain words, or all the words is having this denotative meaning as well as the connotative meaning. So if the sender uses a word and the receiver is getting or understanding it in a very different sense, that will actually affect the communication. The sender means something and the receiver is getting something else. So that kinds of things, if you just consider language, a single comma in itself can entirely change the essence or the meaning of a sentence, right? So in that manner, the misunderstanding between the sender and receiver arising due to the different meanings of words and other symbols used in the communication can be called as semantic barriers, or in other words, you can call it as the various kinds of barriers that occurs due to these differences or based on the various nuances of a language. So that is this semantic barrier is all about. And in this session, we have just focused on 3 important barriers based on that particular question. We have other barriers too. So we have this physiological barrier, that is an important barrier that you can consider. So that is basically the condition. So if you are having if you're having some sickness, or if you're very tired, fatigue, or if you are going through some medical condition, all these things can actually happens or actually affect your communication. So if you are not in good health, you cannot properly convey what you are intending to convey. So physiological barrier is there, cultural barrier is there. So if you are communicating to a person from a different culture, so in that particular time, there are a lot of things that happens. There are a lot of differences between these two people. So in that manner, these cultural differences can actually affect the communication process. So we have cultural barriers and we have technical barriers. So there are a lot of organizational barriers. So we have a lot of types of barriers to consider. But in this session, we have focused on some of the important types, especially when you consider the previous years. If you just focus on the questions that were asked from the barriers to effective communication, these are some of the important types that they very frequently focusing on. So anyway, we have discussed about physical barriers, psychological barriers, and semantic barriers as well. So anyway, the question asks us to find out the option that we could exclude from the list of communication barriers. We have already identified the answer. So physical, semantic, philosophical, psychological. So from the options A, B, D, these 3 options are or that can be considered as barriers, whereas option C, philosophical, can be excluded from the list of communication barriers. So of course, the right answer for this question is option C. So in this session, we have discussed a very important area, that is barriers to effective communication. So we have just focused on 3 important types, and I have just I have just mentioned a few other types of barriers as well. So when you're preparing for your next attempt for an exam, make sure that you're focusing on these 3 important barriers and also the barriers that I have mentioned by the end of this session. And in our LMS platform and in our live sessions, we focus on all the important types of barriers, and we have detailed discussion on all the different types of barriers, which is basically an important area from that point of view. So this kind of a very systematic, very appropriate kind of an approach is very important when you're preparing for this kind of a competitive exam. It's a national level exam. So it's a very serious exam, so make your preparations more serious. Okay. So if you want any kind of assistance from our side, we are providing courses both online and classroom. So if you want to know more about our courses, you can just contact the number that is given in the description box. So thanks for watching and happy learning.